So here's a question. What does authentic leadership look like? Because these days, a lot of people say that they want it or they say that you should have it as a leader. And everyone from self help gurus to leadership coaches to your mom is going to tell you to be real and be vulnerable and be true to yourself. But here's the uncomfortable truth: most people saying those things don't actually understand the real trade offs of being real and being vulnerable or being your true self because they don't do it themselves anyways. And even less people understand how it's related to true authentic leadership. And then even fewer than that are ready for what it really requires to be an authentic leader. So in this episode, I'm going to break down a leadership theory that exploded in its popularity over the years, promised to restore trust, and now faces some serious pushback in the leadership world. And that is authentic leadership. So I'm going to cover what it is, why it gained traction, the research that supports it, and then the criticisms that might change your mind. And I'm not going to stay surface level because on this channel, I break through the fluff and I talk about what actually works. But first, let's give a hat tip to some authors here because this episode was inspired by the article titled Authentic Leadership Theory: The Case for and Against by the scientists William Gardner, Elizabeth Karama, Matt Alvesson, and Katya Einola. Hope I'm saying those names right. And this publishing was put in the Leadership Quarterly and was actually a series of letters written between the two sets of authors debating the merits and the shortcomings of this leadership theory. So let's get into it. Now, authentic leadership didn't emerge out of nowhere. It was a direct response to some really public leadership breakdowns. Think Enron, think WorldCom, think the plethora of government scandals, hollow mission statements across corporations, and leaders who continue to say one thing but do another. And so, in that context, people weren't asking for visionary charisma. They wanted someone who they could trust, someone they thought was real, and someone who they thought meant it. So, the leadership scientists, Bruce Avolio and Bill Gardner, stepped into that vacuum and presented their theory of authentic leadership, which proposed that leaders must first be grounded in who they are before they can lead others effectively. And they weren't just throwing slogans around when they did this, they were proposing a leadership developmental model that was based on positive psychology and a more contemporary leadership model called moral leadership. And they proposed that it was leadership from the inside out, starting with the individual. And that really resonated with people, particularly after these scandals, after world tragedies like 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, and then even again during the 2020 pandemic. And so, in times of disruption, people crave stability. And few things feel more stable than a leader who seems real. But what does that really mean when it comes to leadership and authentic leadership in particular? Well, the theory of authentic leadership is built around four psychological pillars. The first is self awareness. And this isn't just about knowing your strengths, it's also understanding your emotions, understanding your cognitive biases, your blind spots, and also how your presence affects others. A lot of leaders skip this. They don't reflect, they react to the problem in front of them. And according to the theory, that's not authenticity. That is more of an autopilot. The second pillar is relational transparency. In this means a certain amount of openness, but not necessarily oversharing. It doesn't mean bleeding out emotionally, but being honest and transparent in a way that creates trust rather than confusion. And Transparency is something that's really hard as a leader because it requires emotional maturity and emotional discipline, and you have to be able to find a way to articulate and share what you're thinking without offloading your burden as a leader. The third pillar is what the authors call balanced processing. And they characterize this as critical thinking without ego. And it's the ability of a leader to consider views they may disagree with and consider them without filtering through their own biases. Whereas most people listen to respond, an authentic leader, according to the theory, listens to understand what they're hearing. And then the fourth and last pillar is called an internalized moral perspective. And this is where values are going to show up in your actions, where your decisions align with your beliefs, especially when there's pressure or incentives to do otherwise. And so, an authentic leader, according to this theory, is not driven by optics or approval, it's driven more by purpose. And so, when then when those four traits align, the theory says, a leader becomes someone others can genuinely trust and follow. But here's the problem: this theory caught on fire because it gave people what they thought they were missing. It broke up the corporate jargon. It was a model that made leadership feel attainable and human again. And it provided some sort of roadmap that didn't rely on hard to achieve underlying traits like charisma or status or any sort of manipulative or more Machiavellian strategy. It resonates really well with younger generations, millennials who want purpose, Gen Z who want more transparency, and it resonates really well with everyone who's just sick of being lied to. So, of course, this model gained a lot of traction in leadership curriculum, in business schools, in coaching programs, and even social media leadership circles. But we have to consider the fact that just because a theory becomes the new zeitgeist and is popular doesn't mean it actually works in practice. And so that brings us to the other side of the conversation that we have to have when it comes to leadership theory and practice. So, again, let's give the devil its due. There's a reason authentic leadership gained academic traction, there's a reason it gained practical traction. There are lots of studies that show it can boost team engagement and morale. There's studies that show it increased job satisfaction and overall trust in management. There's studies that show it reduces turnover, it promotes ethical decision making and long term performance. It seems to work really well in high uncertainty environments where things feel chaotic, and we need to trust people who seem stable and grounded. And so, circles like healthcare and the military or education or any sort of mission driven startups, authenticity seems to be what can make the difference between things like loyalty and burnout. So, yes, authentic leadership does seem to work. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean it always does. And here's where the cracks start to show. First, the theory and how to implement it can be very vague. You have to ask yourself, what does it really mean to be true to yourself? And what if your true self is something undesirable? It certainly can have an impact on your leadership. And what if you're insecure? What if your true self is inflexible? Or what if your true self is combative? All things that can be detrimental to leadership. So, if you're your true self, well, what do you actually mean by that? Do you understand yourself well enough to know what you mean by that? And then how does your true self actually impact your ability to influence? Second is that there's some cultural context that has to be considered. Authenticity sounds really good in individualistic Western cultures where they pride individualism. But in cultures that are more collectivist, such as Eastern cultures, authenticity, individualism can come off as more self serving, as inappropriate, which in those cultures is going to impact your ability to influence. Another criticism is that there can be situational mismatches. Authenticity in leadership assumes that the leader has the privilege to express themselves fully, but real life is never that clean. And in politics, negotiation, crisis response, transparency might be the thing that actually negatively impacts your mission success rather than helps it. The next criticism that we have to consider is that it can be facilitative towards narcissistic blind spots, because some of the most authentic, authentic and self-assured leaders score themselves really high on authenticity, but that's not necessarily because they're self-aware, but it might actually be because they think they're always right. So another thing that's not ideal when it comes to leadership is having a leader who is being who they actually are, being authentic, but someone that thinks they're always right. Not ideal. And then the fifth and last criticism is there's a lack of addressing of skill development when it comes to authentic leadership. So authenticity alone doesn't make you a good strategist, a good communicator, a good decision maker. If you watched any of my videos about the leadership skills strataplex or the 9 cognitive skills of a leader, it should be really clear that there has to be something more than just being who you are when it comes to being a good leader. So it's an incomplete theory because of at least the lack of skill development. And so while authenticity can be a powerful practice and a powerful part of your leadership journey, it's incomplete and it's certainly no shortcut. So let's dive into the narcissism paradox. Again, you have to ask yourself, what if the people who feel most authentic are actually the ones who are most out of touch? Narcissists, by definition, believe that their view is superior. They are relatively immune to self doubt, and they often overestimate how ethical they're being, and they can certainly overestimate how authentic they're being. It's just the nature of the personality of a narcissist, and this is where it becomes dangerous in leadership roles, because if we take someone who gives themselves a positive self-report at face value and we use that to judge their leadership or judge their authenticity, we're going to reward confidence rather than clarity. And confidence without any sort of introspection, any sort of humility, is generally a recipe for long term failure, and it's a recipe for short term manipulation. Another issue with authenticity in leadership is that identity isn't necessarily fixed. Personality can be relatively stable over time, but your identity grows and is molded by your experiences. We evolved, we adapt, we grow. What feels authentic today may feel false in a year from now or 10 years from now. So how do you determine if you're being authentic or not? How do you lead with awesome authenticity if you're still figuring yourself out? And how do you ever lead with authenticity if you're always figuring yourself out, which I think to some degree everyone should be. They should always be adapting and evolving and growing. So you should never be the same person you were now as you were 5 years ago, at least to some degree. And I think this is particularly relevant for younger leaders or people transitioning to a new industry, something that I'm experiencing myself, someone that is transitioning to a new culture or is experiencing a new team dynamic. Do you cling to your old self or just to appear consistent and to claim authenticity? Or do you evolve and do you grow and do you adapt? And does that make you does that make you fake? Does that make you any less authentic? It's not a simple answer, but it's one of the things that shows why authentic leadership is more of a practice and more of an aspiration and more of a journey rather than a fixed, you're doing it or you're not. And so what I would offer you is what I think is a little bit better of a framework. And that is to not just be yourself, because most of us are inadequate in some way, but you can seek to know yourself better. You can grow in your discernment and wisdom and what to share with your those that you're leading and when to share with those that you're leading. And you can always strive to align your actions with the values that you hold. And so there's a strategic nature that I think is important when trying to practice authentic leadership. And that is you're intentional about when and how you reveal your shortcomings or your vulnerabilities, if that's what you choose. You seek to balance the tension between transparency and clarity, and then you adapt and evolve without faking anything. It's not wise to hide behind the veil of trying to be real in order to avoid growth. And so authentic leadership is a form of leadership that when practiced well can respect both your own integrity and the needs of the team. So where does that leave us? Well, authentic leadership is useful because it gives us a language that we needed when it comes to our leadership portfolio. It called out the destructive and fake leadership of previous decades. It challenges us to lead with values. And I think it's a good reminder that trust in leadership can't be outsourced to something else. But it's important to remember that authenticity alone, again, is not going to make you a great leader. There's a lot more practical things that are also required, like skills. And so the really, really successful leaders are those that are both self aware, but not self absorbed, and they're transparent and but they're not necessarily performative. They are driven by their values, but they are strong convictions that are held loosely. So they're not necessarily rigid. And so, in a world full of noise, particularly in the leadership circles, real leadership is going to require something a little more than just being real with the people that you lead. It also requires wisdom and decision making and tactical clarity and a fair degree of courage in order to evolve. So, thanks for watching. If you're ready to stop following the leadership zeitgeist or trend of the week and get into some deep work with your leadership, hit the like, hit the subscribe, drop a comment, under the video, and I'll see you next time.